Buenas tardes, es un gusto tener con nosotros y en nuestro primer evento académico híbrido del Laboratorio de Psicolingüística a la doctora Olivera Savic, a quien Alejandra nos va a hacer el favor de presentar y posteriormente escucharemos su plática, aproximadamente 40-45 minutos, para posteriormente dar lugar a las preguntas. Les recordamos a aquellos que nos están acompañando en YouTube que pueden poner en el chat sus preguntas y con gusto nosotros vamos a transmitir las preguntas a la doctora. Bienvenida, doctora. Adelante.
Gracias. Buenas tardes. Vamos a leer una pequeña semblanza de la doctora Savic, quien es investigadora de la Universidad del Estado de Ohio, en Estados Unidos, donde funge como investigadora principal del Laboratorio de Desarrollo Cognitivo, trabajando de manera colaborativa con el doctor Vladimir Slotsky. ¿Es verdad? Las principales líneas de investigación de la doctora Savic se enfocan en el desarrollo de la semántica y la adquisición del lenguaje. Sus investigaciones se apoyan de distintas técnicas, como las pruebas conductuales, utilizando el rastreo de la mirada, y medidas electrofisiológicas, tanto en población infantil como en adultos. Igualmente, la doctora Savic realiza estudios con modelamiento computacional y medidas neuropsicológicas y trabaja tanto con personas como con animales en investigaciones relacionadas con el aprendizaje y la atención. Cuenta con múltiples publicaciones en revistas internacionales de alto impacto, como lo son Cognition y Plus One, entre otras, donde ha colaborado con investigadores de diferentes países. A continuación, la doctora Savic nos va a presentar la conferencia que se titula Building Blocks of Conceptual Development, y como nos dijo la doctora Natalia Ariastrepo, la ponencia tomará aproximadamente 40 minutos y luego pasaremos a preguntas y comentarios por parte de nuestro auditorio. Doctora Savic, the floor is yours.
Thank you. You will let me know if you do not hear me well. Yes, maybe I'll stand, so that way it will be easier. I'll need pause. Okay, so I will talk about conceptual development, and when I Okay, thank you. Okay, that's good. So I will talk about conceptual development, and what I mean by that is how do we acquire our general knowledge about the world. So we often in cognitive psychology call our general knowledge about the world and humans as conceptual knowledge or semantic knowledge, and I will use these terms interchangeably, but in both cases they denote our general knowledge about the world, how we know what a table or a chair is, an apple, or even more abstract things like something being solid, juicy, or more abstract concepts like art, theory, and so on. So before I start talking about my research, I would like to motivate this talk. Let me just see how to move. Maybe I'll have to do this. By just saying a few words about why is conceptual development worth studying. So there are at least two good reasons. And the first one is that conceptual knowledge is critical for everyday functioning. One of the reasons why conceptual knowledge is so useful is because our knowledge about the world, our knowledge of apples, horses, trees, birds, and so on, is not just like randomly stored in our memory. Actually, as we learn it, all of the information that we gather about the world becomes organized, and it becomes organized in a meaningful way, so that information about the concepts that share some meaning are stored together and in a similar way. We often call this organization of our knowledge lexicosemantic organization, because the information about the concepts is lexicalized and it's organized in accordance to semantic relations. On this slide here, you can see that these concepts share some links. These are semantic links based on what these concepts mean. and I will talk about them more later. Why is this important? Well, this is important because it is this kind of organization of our knowledge that allows us, our knowledge to support a myriad of knowledge-dependent functions like language, learning, planning, memory retrieval, reasoning, prediction that we talked just before this talk, and we rely on it in our everyday activities all the time. However, we are not born with this kind of organized knowledge, and instead, it needs to be developed somehow. So another important question is, right, how do we get there? How do we get to having this wonderfully organized semantic organization? We know that we start very modest. So this is a simulation of a semantic organization at the age of 6 months. But not only that we start very modest and that we are not born with all of this knowledge, but this knowledge develops fairly quickly. So this should be potentially semantic organization at 18 months and 30 months. So you can see that it very rapidly becomes very complex, almost intractable. And the question even more then becomes, how do we get there? So what drives the development of conceptual knowledge about the knowledge about the world? There are at least 2 possible ways, and one is through regularities in the visual input, and the other one is through regularities in the linguistic input. I'm interested in both of these routes for building our conceptual knowledge, and I studied them under the topics of visual category learning and lexicosemantic organization. I studied different topics, and this is just like some examples of the topics that I study under these big 2 teams in collaboration with other people. But today, I will focus on the right side of this graph, and I will talk about acquiring semantic knowledge through regularities in the linguistic input. There are at least 2 good reasons for this decision. One is that this is shared interest with some of the labs and research lines that you have active here. And the other one is that this line of research is partially at least motivated by some of Natalia's early work. More specifically, the motivation for my studies that I will talk about today comes from studies that show that we have some rudiments of semantically organized knowledge very, very early. And we know from some work from Natalia and other people that even at the age of 21 months, children, and in some studies even earlier, children are able to recognize that certain concepts are semantically related. There are other studies that support this assumption, and some even show that some rudiments of this organized knowledge are available even at the age of 6 months. So when I read these studies for the first time, I was puzzled because this seems very early. This seems very early for, like, imagine a 6-month-old to understand that the chair and the table are somehow related. And this is sometimes not necessarily between items and objects that are visually too similar. And it's more some kind of knowledge that you need to extract and seemingly form some maybe abstract relations. Yes. It's good to continue? Yes. Okay. Okay. So I was puzzled by these findings because I know from my studies in visual category learning that where I try to teach 4-year-olds, so much older children, to differentiate between groups of items, for example, category A and category B, based on some form of similarity. And in this case, this is visual similarity. These items may share multiple features, they might share some rule. And in these studies, what we get is there is a lot of development that happens even after the age of 4. So even at the age of 4, many learning mechanisms and attention mechanisms that are required for forming semantic categories, or in this case, very simple even visual categories, matures very slowly, has very protracted development. So then I wondered, well, where could then the knowledge about the semantic relatedness between concepts come from? So if it's too early for babies to get it from visual experience, if you think what this baby could see, right? Just imagine how slowly their vision develops, how much they can actually see. They are not even necessarily very active until much later. So what they are exposed to is seemingly insufficient. So visual input seems insufficient to support building very richly semantically organized knowledge. So one idea then that I have is, well, if visual input is not rich, these babies actually hear a lot of language, and this language is rich in regularities that could potentially, in principle, help them understand the semantics of the world. So what kind of regularities I'm talking about? I'm talking about very simple regularities in which words co-occur in language. So words do not occur in language in some random way, right? They occur in predictable ways. So there's words that share some meaning, typically occur together. For example, juicy apple, juicy pear. Because apple and pear share the property of juiciness, they often co-occur with these words. And this simple co-occurrence in language can inform us about the properties and meaning of concepts. In addition, there are also regularities that are not necessarily observable, like juicy apple, juicy pear. That's a simple co-occurrence regularity that's directly observable from the input. There are also regularities with which certain words tend to co-occur with the same words. So for example, apple and pear do not necessarily need to reliably co-occur together, but if they share their co-occurrence with the word juicy, so they co-occur in the context of the same words, they may also become linked. So that's one of the properties in language, that these regularities are very present, and there were these ideas from even like early philosophy that this might be the way how we can learn the meaning of words. So this idea, as I said, existed early in like philosophy and linguistics, but actually became very powerful and more prominent much recently, because most of the natural language processing algorithms nowadays, although have much fancier machinery behind them, they rely on the same idea, that you can learn a lot about the meaning from simple regularities of co-occurrence of words in language. I was personally first intrigued about this idea and found that we now have evidence that this is not just a good idea, but that actually language input is sufficiently rich from the early work from Landauer and Domain. But we now really do have a lot of information and a lot of support for this being not only a good idea, but that language input is really rich in these kinds of regularities. Then in principle could support learning meaning. So we know from the natural language processing work that machines can do this. So machines can learn meaning from simple co-occurrence regularities in language. But this is not sufficient to say that babies do that the same, right? So what is necessary to say that this is also useful regularity for human learners? I broke it in or how we can estimate that these regularities do contribute to semantic development. I broke it into 3 topics that I would like to point. And the first one is that language input is rich in regularities that can support semantic development. The second one is that human learners are sensitive to these regularities. And the third question that we need to understand is how the accumulation of experience of these regularities and learning mechanisms that allow us to extract these regularities potentially develop during semantic development, and whether they can explain changes in semantic development. So the answer to the first question seems we already have, and it comes from, as I said, some early work in distributional semantics and more recent computational work. So this gives us enough evidence to say that, yes, the input is rich enough. The next question, whether human learners are sensitive to these regularities, is a little bit more complicated, but it seems that we also have enough evidence to at least suspect that that's possible. So there is very rich literature in statistical learning that shows that even from early on, even infants, 6-month-old infants are sensitive to regularities of co-occurrence in input. And that has been proven for auditory input, visual input, cross-modally. So children and infants can rely on these regularities to learn about properties of language. Studies from my lab that I will not talk about today show that in language it works the same, so human learners are sensitive to these regularities. One important property to note here is that most of the statistical learning dealt only with one type or multiple types, but under the category of observable regularities, and did very little work on these regularities that are more of a derived nature. So that you first need to build some links based on the observable regularities, and then from that to infer some more higher order regularities. So, but at least this gives us some idea that from early on, we are sensitive to these regularities, we track these regularities, and we rely on these regularities to learn about properties of language. So the third question, and the one that I'm primarily focused on, now that we know that 1 and 2 are at least sort of checked, is how then, if these regularities are present in input and we are sensitive to these regularities, how could they drive our development? So we definitely need to be exposed to these regularities, so we need to accumulate experience with these regularities, but also there is a question of our ability to learn these regularities. When do we get this ability, and what is the nature of the mechanisms that support this kind of learning? So that's what I'll be mostly talking about today. Back to this slide before, where I show you that our knowledge about the world is organized in accordance to different kinds of semantic links. Here it will be important to point out that we typically differentiate between 2 types of links that we think are important for our semantic organization: associative and taxonomic links. Associative links are links that connect items that are typically observed together, that go together, like apple and juicy, apple and tree. And taxonomic links are links that typically connect items that belong to the same semantic category, like category of fruits or category of furniture, and so on. Both of these are critical for our everyday functioning. For example, associative links can predict, inform us about prediction of what word will come next in language. And as I talk, you keep predicting what word will come next, and that helps your comprehension if you have semantically organized the system and you have built associative links. On the other hand, taxonomic links are also useful because they are key to one of the critical components of human intelligence, and that's generalization of knowledge from familiar to novel. If you know that apple is healthy, you can infer that quiz is also healthy based on the taxonomic relationships between apple and quiz. Importantly, I want to point out here that both of these types of semantic links that shape our semantic organization can be learned from co-occurrence regularities in language. And this is how. So, from sentences that I've shown before, we can form associative links based on direct co-occurrence of words. So we can form associative links between juicy and apple and juicy and pear based on direct co-occurrence. And we can form taxonomic links based on the shared co-occurrence that apple and pear have with juicy. So because both apple and pear occur in context of the same word, we can form this shared co-occurrence link, which can support taxonomic links. As I said before, we know that these regularities are present in language because machines can learn from them. But the question is, are humans sensitive to these regularities? And if they are, when do these abilities develop? So here it's important to differentiate. We have 2 abilities, like one to detect direct co-occurrence in language, observable co-occurrence, and the other one to build on that to form links that are based on shared co-occurrence. I typically leave the big questions for the end, but I don't want to keep you confused. So if there is any clarification question, you can ask now. Okay, or you can raise your hand if there is any clarification. So, how do we develop semantic organization potentially from co-occurrence regularities? One idea, which makes sense and has support in based on like what we know from statistical learning and like computational literature, is that experience might be sufficient. So you may be just fed with a lot of rich language input, which has like rich structure, and that might be sufficient from very early on if you're born with these abilities to learn from co-occurrence, as some statistical learning studies suggest that they develop very, very early. So maybe experience is sufficient. So you just collect regularities, and as you collect these regularities, you start building first direct co-occurrence links, and you build on them shared co-occurrence links as you accumulate enough of the regularities. However, it's possible, so this is the first hypothesis, that both abilities to form direct and shared links are available from early on, and the only thing that decides on the shape of the semantic development is the accumulation of experience. The other hypothesis is that maybe, as statistical literature suggests, we do have ability from early on to form direct co-occurrence links, those observable ones, but ability to form shared links might develop. So that ability to build on the simple links may be something that develops. Finally, it's possible that in addition to experience and ability to form shared links, ability to form direct links also develops. So there are three hypotheses at least that we can differentiate: that experience alone is sufficient, or that abilities to form links from experience also develop. And this is what I tested in my studies. This was the main goal of the studies, because this is like a critical thing to understand how language regularities potentially can contribute. If experience is sufficient, then you just feed your child with enough of language input, and they can build a semantically organized network just as a machine, right? Machines do not consider any development. They think that all of this is available at the same time, right? All the input, all the machinery. However, it's possible that even if you give your child enough exposure, that they may not profit from it if they're not ready to learn from that kind of thing. So in order to test for the roles of experience and maturation, we designed experiments in which we gave the same experience with co-occurrence regularities to people, participants of different age. And in these particular studies, there were 4 years of age and adults. And we presented them with language input that is rich in these kinds of regularities that I talked before, from which you can, in principle, if you're sensitive to these regularities, form both direct co-occurrence regularities and shared co-occurrence regularities. They saw sentences such as, "I'd like a nice foodly apple," or "that store has really foodly meat." As you can see here, we use a combination of familiar and novel words. And the first part of the sentence was changing, right? But what stayed constant, what was the regularity, is that foodly and apple reliably co-occurred and foodly and myth reliably co-occurred. So that they formed these sort of triads where foodly preceded reliably both apple and myth. Okay, and based on that regularity, we suspected that participants can learn these links and rely on these links at test. In these studies, we use only 2 triads. One is the apple triad, foodly apple myth, and the other one is horse triad, doggish horse, dodge yak. At training, participants heard sentences that contain these regularities and that could foster formation of direct and shared co-occurrence links. And in this specific experiment, they only heard 10 sentences per each pair of words. So they heard foodly apple in 10 sentences and then foodly myth in 10, but it was intermixed, right? It was not blocked. And then we tested their knowledge of direct and shared co-occurrence links that they could learn from these regularities. And to test direct links, we used sentence completion tasks. So we gave them sentences which ended in one of the these 5 words. So, for example, they could hear "I'd like a nice foodly," and if they learned anything from the training, then they would know that the word that could follow would be apple or milk. And they could do this based on the simple regularity of co-occurrence in the training. To measure whether they also formed shared co-occurrence regularities, they had a different test that was motivated by generalization tasks. So participants saw visual items that were from 2 categories: category of fruit and category of mammals. So they belong to the category that familiar words in the training belong to. And they were asked to label these novel items, novel fruit and animals, with the pseudonouns that shared co-occurrence with familiar nouns at training. So for example, they would be asked to label the item that denotes a fruit by words mip and gek. If they learn the regularity that apple shares co-occurrence with mip, then they would generalize that mip might also be a fruit. That would show that they can build on shared co-occurrence regularity to form a semantic link that's like same category. And what did we get? So in the first experiment, where they only heard 10 sentences per each pair of words, we found that both children and adults were sensitive to direct co-occurrence regularities. Adults were better, but both children and adults were sensitive. Here, the chance performance is 0 because it's a production task. In the test of shared links, we found that only adults, but not children, were able to build on these regularities that they formed, direct co-occurrence links, to form same category links. And this was very interesting, and we thought in training, but in this experiment, children also didn't form very strong direct co-occurrence regularities. So we could not conclude based on this one experiment that they lacked ability to form shared. Maybe, right, quite likely, they could just form very weak direct co-occurrence links that were not strong enough to support the relation to shared co-occurrence links. So we ran another experiment in which we tripled the exposure that children and adults got. And what we got is that with triple training, both children and adults learned better. So they formed much stronger direct co-occurrence links. Critically, however, again, only adults were able to form shared co-occurrence links. And what is interesting comparison and critical comparison here is that when you look at the adults with short training and children with long training, the strength of direct co-occurrence links is comparable, right? But their ability to form shared links is not. So even with the same strength of direct co-occurrence links, we got big, large developmental differences in formation of shared links. So from this, to conclude, we found that both adults can form both direct and shared links, that 4-year-olds only form direct links, that both direct and shared links undergo development after the age of 4, and that even direct links are equally, when direct links are equally robust, there are age differences on shared links. So these findings seem to highlight the importance of maturation. Even when you give participants the same experience, they show developmental differences and on both types of the links. Critically more important and larger differences on formation of shared links. This was interesting, but then we only found that 4-year-olds are not able to form shared co-occurrence links, and this didn't tell us much. So when do we become able to form shared co-occurrence links? So we replicated the same study using the middle group, 7 to 8-year-olds, because we suspected that that might be the age where they might start building this kind of regularities, because we know from the semantic development studies with familiar words that that's the age, school age, when children become more sensitive to taxonomic links. In this experiment with 4-year-olds, 7-year-olds, and adults, we use the same training, but at test, we test both direct and shared co-occurrence links in the same paradigm. So we were aware that our previous version with different paradigms may not be ideal to compare development of direct and shared links. So here we now use the same paradigm, and this what we call label extension here, to test both types of links. The only difference is whether a new image, which could be a mammal, an animal, or a fruit, is now labeled with the adjective that tends to precede items of this category, or with a noun that shares co-occurrence with the nouns of that category. And our results from this study with 4-year-olds and adults completely replicated the previous set of experiments. And interestingly, 7-year-olds do present this middle group, where we can see that they form, again, direct co-occurrence links, which will be stronger or the same as 4-year-olds, but weaker than in adults. And they do form also shared co-occurrence links, but not at the strength of adults. So this gave us more sort of confidence in our idea of importance of maturation of abilities to form links. It is also interesting just to quickly point out that what the trend that we found here for development of abilities to form links from co-occurrence nicely matches the semantic development of associative and taxonomic links that's detected when kids are tested on familiar words that they learned through their experience. So, to conclude this part, we found that co-occurrence can foster both associative and taxonomic links, but its contribution changes with the development of abilities to form semantic links from this exposure. So, we concluded that semantic organization could be then shaped by co-occurrence regularities in language, because the trajectories of development associative and taxonomic links seem to match developmental trajectories of development of abilities to form direct and shared links from direct and shared co-occurrence regularities. I think I spent 35 minutes so far or something like that. So I have, is somebody tracking time?
Okay.
Okay, so
we have like 15 minutes.
Yeah. Okay, wonderful. Okay, I can tag this in about 10 minutes then. So what we learned so far is that language input is a rich source of information for building semantically organized knowledge, and we found that both experience and maturation can be useful. However, I still didn't get answer to that question of mine that I said that I was intrigued by some of the studies that Natalia published and some other people, where they found that very, very early in development, they detect semantic links or sensitivity to semantic links that seems like sensitivity to the same category. So the next question that I worked on with my colleague is, if we know that there is development of abilities to learn from co-occurrence, so there is some limitation to our capacity to learn early on, and we also know there is limitation to the input that we have. So machines get all of the input at once and then have like very complex computations on these enormous input and then spit out something that looks like semantic organization. But children learn, need to collect this information through time. So it's possible that their input early on is much more limited, and what our studies show, their mechanisms of learning are limited. So the question then becomes, aren't only with limited input and simple learning mechanisms that we know that they possess very early on, can humans develop semantic knowledge from regularities of word use? What I mean by that is, what if everything that you have early on is just ability to track simple co-occurrence regularities? So you forget about shared co-occurrence, you cannot do that till very late. You can only track whether juicy and apple co-occur, whether juicy and pear co-occur. Can this get you to understanding that apple and pear share some links? And the idea is, potentially, if apple and pear also directly co-occur. So it's possible that in early language input to young children, words that denote items of the same category also reliably co-occur. If that is true, then we can see semantic co-priming between the items of the same category early on, based on just this sensitivity. Very simple learning mechanism, very simple sensitivity. To test this hypothesis, we looked at the CHILDIS, which you might be familiar with, right? Which is large database of child-directed speech, which is luckily for us transcribed. And we calculated reliable co-occurrence of words in CHILDIS. We use something that we call T-score. It's not too important into the theoretical details, but technical details, but the idea is very simple. So we looked at reliable co-occurrence, which means not just simple co-occurrence of words in language, because simple co-occurrence does not necessarily support semantic links. If you have an apple, right, that's a very frequent co-occurrence, but an apple are not reliably co-occurring or informing you about semantic relatedness, because an article also co-occurs very frequently with other words. So what we compute here is whether words co-occur together more reliably with each other than with other words, which means that T-score is just like the measure that takes into account observed co-occurrence and expected co-occurrence based on the frequency of the words. That's all. And what we did is that we took from MCDI words, and they're also grouped based on the categories. And we took groups of these words that denote same categories, like words that denote dish or clothing or animals. And we computed their reliable co-occurrence of each word, pair of words. And we did the same for our randomly sampled words from the early vocabulary. And then we, using the network approach, we here connected those words that reliably co-occur based on T-score. And what you can see this, although not very well, these are very noisy networks, you can see that randomly selected words do not get links. So they do not get edges in the network, because edges are made only between the words that have high T-scores. We here set it at 1 standard deviation, but graphs look very similar if it's 2 standard deviations from the mean. But words that belong to the same semantic category do get connected based on just simple, reliable co-occurrence. So this was thought very cool and intriguing. And here I'll just present it in a slightly maybe easier to read way. This is a graph that shows for, I forgot, like more than 15 categories that we could select from the early vocabulary: animals, body parts, clothing, color, dishes, eating, and so on. We calculated reliable co-occurrence between same category words versus the words that are matched for frequency but are randomly selected. So using permutations of like 10,000 or something like that. And what you can see here, and we did that for like different window sizes. So we ran different window sizes for this large corpus, but regardless of the small technical details, we do get the same result. Majority of semantic categories seems to be able to at least build some initial rudimentary links just based on reliable concurrence. As I said from before, many of these things were inspired by some of Natalia's early work. So next thing that we did is that we tried to see whether we can also explain some of the results from the studies that show early semantic priming, whether we can explain, at least partially, some of these results based on the measures that we use of reliable concurrence of words. And what they show you is that it is possible, at least partially, to explain these results, because here we show based on the T-score measure, we can differentiate between unrelated and related pairs in these studies. So this is important to point. This is not to say that you can build all taxonomic links or fully build taxonomic knowledge just from simple concurrence in language. What this says is that this information may be useful to, as a starting point, as a rudimentary thing that can support further taxonomic development. So we do not know whether whether children truly can form, or infants can truly form something that we call a true semantic taxonomic link from this kind of regularity, but this does suggest that this is a rich source of information. And since we know that there are sensitive links, that it can potentially be a good starting point for building this kind of links before we are able to employ our selective attention mechanisms and other learning mechanisms in memory to use other sources of information to build semantic knowledge, and specifically taxonomics. This is just a short conclusion. Conference can foster those associative and taxonomic links, which are critical for semantic organization, but the contribution of these regularities does change through development, and it depends on our ability to learn from these links, which also develops. Importantly, even very simple conference can explain much of the early semantic links. And what I'm currently mostly interested in, what I'm currently working on, is what is that develops? And what is the mechanism of the change? So we did find that seemingly very early, we can build direct conference links, and then that we need something extra to build shared conference links. However, from the previous set of studies, it's unclear what these abilities might be, whether it's ability to integrate this information, whether it's something about the differences in prediction mechanisms that we use. That's still unclear, but it will be critical to understand how can we then support this kind of learning, if that's even possible. So that's the main topic of my ongoing research. So better understand the nature of the mechanisms that support learning from conference and language. That's it. Thank you.
A question from people who are most of the literature. How maturation was estimated? That is, what is biological definition or biomotor control definition?
Can you repeat the first part of the question?
How maturation was estimated?
Oh, that's a good question. So that's exactly what I'm currently interested on. We very sort of generally estimated maturation. So we wanted to make distinction between the assumption that says that experience is enough, right? So pure experiential, and assumption, hypothesis says that experience is necessary, but there is something else. So something that needs to develop. So we do not have any specific definition of maturation. We define it very generally, that there is a developmental or maturational aspect to learning from conference. And we do not know what that is. And this is what, as I said, I'm currently working on to better understand what is that develops, what is that changes and matures. So from this set of studies, the only thing that we can rule out is that experience is not sufficient, and then there are different developmental trajectories for different types of learning mechanisms. That's what we currently know, and we have maybe some hints based on the nature of the regularities that we tested, what they might be, but that's a good question. We do not know what exactly matures.
Thank you. Someone in the audience wants to do a question?
There are two, but
how do you know that your training is long enough for children? Maybe adults need a short exposition than young children.
yes, we didn't know when we started. That's why we started with a short experiment, and then we could see that children, even after very short exposure, can build direct conference links, right? And that's why we did that other study that I tested, where we tried to look at the effects of expanded exposure. So here. So we did try to test the effects of like amount of exposure that children get. And in this case, it's only like the difference between 1 session and 3 sessions. And all of this is not ultimate answer. It does give us good confidence in saying that with more exposure, children can build stronger direct conference links. But with this more exposure, it doesn't seem that this exposure alone helps shared conference links. So this just gave us sort of more confidence in the claim that shared conference links develop late. Does that answer?
Yeah, but also it's possible that they need more exposure.
Even more.
Even more.
Yes.
Because semantic leaks are developed across 2 years, for example.
That's very true, and it's possible that some of these learning mechanisms are actually very, very slow mechanisms that are not super easy to catch in the lab environment, right? So we have a very big longitudinal project that is submitted, not funded yet, that is trying to look at that, where we actually plan to track children for a period of 4 years from the age 4 to the age 8. There are studies that are planned to be exactly what you suggest, to track more like longitudinally, to track the effects of exposure, because it's possible that these are some very, very slow learning mechanisms. So yes, not super easy to capture, but you're getting in that direction.
Right.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions that may be because I might not have understand.
Sure, go ahead.
How would you think that taxonomic organization, the shared one, may arise because of language linearity and not because of a concurrence between multisensory concurrence and language hierarchy processing? What I mean is your experimental stimuli are like modifier position plus nucleus position, like
yes.
in a adjective-like form. Why would the shared relation emerge not from the taxonomic of symbolic pieces, but from the understanding of the hierarchical structure? But because shared links between your lexical items are modifier arguments, and I mean they are like not only semantic, but they are also like syntactic. They are making a predicament of the nominal head.
So if I understood well, there are at least 2 things I can say, and then you let me know whether that's answered. So it is true. So you are forming taxonomic links between the items that are of the same syntactic class, right? They're nouns. But that wouldn't help you. Let me just go back to the schematic so it will be clear. So that's true, that can help you. You're building these links between the nouns, but what we are testing is whether you're building these links between horse and get and apple and mint, right? Not any of the nouns. So if it would be based only on syntactic property, then you couldn't differentiate between horse, get, and apple making, right? So you would then equally build the link between get and apple, just as horse and apple.
Well, maybe if you're considering the theta criterion that says about the semantic hierarchical structures and only from a generative perspective, the syntactic rules are also like constrained by semantic relations. Like for example, the number of in English. That you can say many to some nouns, but not to other nouns. So that maybe that you are forcing a theta criterion relation that may be also considered like such shared taxonomy. But I think that may also be considered as theta criterion. So that would be interesting for you to see, because I think that you are emerging 2 kinds of relationships, not only the semantic one between undirected links, but also a syntactic one, given the theta criterion that directs semantic knowledge. And because of that, also was what would be the relation between maturation and hierarchy consolidation? Like, I don't know, those examples of learning grammars of A, N, A, times N, like that types of codes that not all toddlers can acquire at a very early age. But it seems like the lexical sprout also relates with this kind of hierarchical and syntactical complexity.
What you say, like, I mean, it's definitely true that this is not whole story by any means. What we try to do in these experiments is to form the simplest possible structure for the simplest possible mechanisms, and to see when these are the cues that you have, and we try to keep other things under control, right, as much as possible. When these are the only cues that you have, can you build these links? It's definitely true that other cues can help, that's for sure. But when you have just this, how much you can learn from that? And then it's not, it's not maybe impossible, but it's very hard to get rid of some of these other influences when you're dealing with language. But we did our best to, for example, not use the same sentence position. So they are not occurring always in the same position. So you cannot rely on that kind of cues. And we did not get completely rid of syntactic cues, but syntactic cues give you only a part of the story. And there were, in this specific experimental conditions, there were no other useful cues, right? So that was as much as we could do, right? But that doesn't mean that other, like when you learn in the real world, that other things are not supporting this kind of learning. No, by not. But anyway, this is just showing that this is one potentially important driver of learning.
Okay, thank you very much. One last question. Have you tried putting do this word after the noun?
Yes. So yes, because we are also interested in the role of prediction in learning. So whether it is critical that, like, like whether you learn the same way when the verb precedes or succeeds. And in adults, we do get effects, like in primary tasks, we do get effects for both types of order, but we haven't done it with children yet. So I don't know what happens in children, but adults can do it even if you have the opposite order, so that the shared item comes after the items that you're interested in sharing the link.
Another question from YouTube. Some studies found differences between the types of associations shown by participants of different ages. Given your results, you think these differences are due to maturation more than experience? How do you think experience affects?
Well, experience definitely is necessary and it contributes, but from what we so far know, at early age, it only contributes to the type for building that kind of links, like as we showed, like direct occurrence links for which you have abilities. So definitely does support, but it supports only to the extent that you are able to process. If the question is more complicated, which I'm not sure, like it's a little bit hard to get now, whether there are some interactions between experience and maturation, that's also possible, but it's not possible to detect in these kinds of designs. So we, from the study that I mentioned before, we do have a more complex design in which we track children, we'll hopefully we get funding, track children longitudinally, so they can actually measure their experience, and they measure it by measuring their input, language input at home, and by tracking like what they read, so, and other like measures. So we can truly track the experience, and we track the development of abilities over 4 years of their development, so that we can really disentangle the different influences and roles of experience and maturation, and then we'll be able also to look at the interaction, because we will be able to do cross-panel analysis and then to look at more complex models than what is possible with just simple one-session experiment.
A related question is how maturation and awareness are helping to improve the learning process. Are those important aspects in the language development?
Can you repeat the first part?
How maturation and awareness are helping to improve the learning process?
Well, as I said previously, this is like a very broad and like a big question that we still do not have answer to, because we do not know what exactly matures and what exactly develops. So far, we only know that something also maturation that happens that you cannot equate the child and the machine. And this is, it might seem trivial from some perspective, but this is actually critical because many of the most of the work that draws conclusions from the computation literature does not take into account this important limitation. So from that perspective, it's very important to understand what and when matures. And yes, we are on the path to get there, not yet there. Yes.
I think you have shown us that in a way, the language, the input that babies receive mirrors the experience they get. So in a way, it's difficult to disentangle these years. So this is just a comment. I would like to hear, of course, if you have any opinion about that. And the second one is just if you can let us know, why do you think children, at least your 7-year-old in your experiment, could form the direct links, but in a weaker manner, the shared links? So it seems that thematic links are developing, I don't know if stronger or before the taxonomic links.
So to answer your first question, it's definitely true that language mirrors the environment to a large extent. And that's especially true for concrete sort of concepts that we were talking about. But then there is a large variety of other concepts that are very hard to capture in visual experience. And they don't have to be too complex or abstract, even like, you know, like adjectives or verbs, or like even something that's available early in the input is harder to capture in the visual experience. And then you build on that all the words that you have to learn solely for language because they do not have visual reference. So these two greatly overlap, that's for sure. But then there is also part that can also only be learned from language or be easier to learn from language. And then there is part that might be easier to be learned from the visual environment. So the idea is that they're not in contradiction, but that they might support each other. And as I said, like because the regularities, we found that regularities, even reliable co-occurrence is something that can support building taxonomic links. That doesn't say that that's the whole story, but because there is overlap, they might be supporting each other. So you might come prepared before you're able to detect that items have visual overlap. You may be better prepared for that because you have in language that kind of regularity that may in some cases be more salient than in others. Depending on what is your visual experience, how much experience you have, or whether it's possible to have visual experience with some concepts. Your second question was regarding the 7-year-olds study, where we got that they're late, they're developing. Okay, so here, so we are capturing this pattern there, and like we repeated this with eye tracking and some other paradigms. And then what changes, the only thing that changes, sorry, my cursor is not visible, it's okay. So the only thing that changes is whether the direct links are a little bit stronger, depending on the test. But there is always this pattern that direct links seem to develop throughout this period, and that the shared links start to develop at the age of 7. Why in our study that happened? This could be purely, if we look only at 7-year-olds, we will not be able to figure out whether it's experience maturation. It could be simply because you first need to form direct co-occurrence links, and they need to be sort of fairly robust, so you're able to form shared co-occurrence links. So just based on experiential account, simple experiential account, you would expect the same effect, that shared links are slightly weaker than direct co-occurrence links. So just looking at one age group, it's hard to tell what leads to that, but what we think, and what it does show, at least to some extent, is that you do not get share links for free. So it is not that you build this direct co-occurrence links based on observed co-occurrence, and then you for free get shared co-occurrence links, which some learning mechanisms in some model do suggest that, for example, Nickberg, Brown, and Shapiro have some work that it seemingly suggests that shared links are a consequence of direct powerful links, but since you have one, so you have the others too. So at least that we can say it's not true, and that there is something additional, which I keep saying that we don't know what it is, but we're very interested to understand better. What is that extra that you need to form this more complex derived form of things?
Thank you. Another question?
Yeah, I have one.
Yes, yes.
I was wondering if during the experiments that you talked to us about, was there a control of or the data collected was analyzed in terms of socioeconomic status of participants? Because, well, input, experience, interaction, and all that has been linked many times to that particular variable. What do you?
Yes, that's true. So these kids are sampled broadly from suburbs of Columbus, which are of middle class suburbs of Columbus. We don't have diversity in the socioeconomic status. We do have diversity in their ethnical backgrounds, but not enough to make comparisons. But this is something that we plan to do on a larger sample of planned 200 participants, where we will be able to look at not only their socioeconomic status, but the education of their parents and their different measures of their exposure to language, which will measure even, I think, more directly the richness, right, of their experience, which is often approximated by socioeconomic status. So we're actually more interested in these like more direct measures, but we do plan to compare them with more typically used socioeconomic measures. So we know already that we will probably based on previous studies, we can expect that the children in lower economic classes will get less exposure. But studies demonstrate that there are types of learning that do not require a lot of exposure. So it's possible the direct reference links to develop those. It might not require a lot of exposure, but if we are talking about some very slow learning mechanisms that support deriving more complex kinds of links, it is possible that we will see that kind of discrepancy, that for some types of learning, we can do it with very limited input, while other types of learning do require more richer structures and which may come with differences in socioeconomic status. So I do not know, but we do suspect that that might be something important.
Okay, thank you.
We have time for another question.
There was one question there, please.
I have two questions, so I don't know if there's time for both of them.
Go ahead, we'll try.
The first one is general, it's about the relationship of computer science and cognitive science.
Yes.
And it seems to me that a lot of techniques or a lot of things worked on computer science, like the statistical learning, self-organizing maths and whatnot, often inspired some research on cognitive science. So I guess my first question is, like, what makes a good model for cognitive science, and like what are perhaps some limitations of depending, I guess, on like computers or emulating cognitive.
Well, that's true. All this fancy work that we rely on today when we Google and look for translation is based on some old ideas in cognitive science. And I just mentioned one paper that was at that time very influential about distributional semantics. But I think that it goes both ways, right? Like these people, like in computational science, they were very much inspired by this work, but I think that we can find, and I personally find a lot of inspiration in their work, because if there was no for that work, we would not have such a good proof of principle that language is sufficiently rich, because it's impressive what the learning mechanism that knows nothing about the world, and that's maybe partial answer to your question too, right? These algorithms have no visual input of any sort. Nothing, no explicit instructions. They don't know anything about syntax. They do not build any inference from this. They only learn from simplest regularities, and that's sufficient for them to be able to communicate. Whether they understand, whether they have concepts, right, that's a different question. And that's the thing they do not, sorry, I'll go back. The goals of these algorithms and models was not to mimic the system as it functions, right? But there are some useful lessons to take from them. What we do need then is to go back to the cognitive science and to understand better what are the mechanisms that are available to humans in order to build a model that will work as a model of human mind, right? And the current models do not do that yet, just because we do not have sufficient understanding of some of these mechanisms that may support that kind of learning. So that's what's needed. We need first to understand the learning mechanisms to be able to build them into these systems. But thanks to them, we have a lot of information that we can draw inspiration from. And you have a second question, and then if there is time, we can go back.
Yeah, my second question is more practical, and it's the experimental design. It seems to me that the experiment heavily relies on novel words and novel practices in order to understand this personally. So I was interested in what was the criteria behind the novel practices, and now like what made you choose those specifically for topics.
How did you choose novel ones? Is that the question?
Yeah. Like what was like the criteria for selecting
Well, we built a set of novel words that based on simply based on the sounds that can be pronounced at the age of 3. And then we built a set of these kind of words and gave it to participants, adult participants, to score it for like associative strength with familiar words. So basically just to give us associations with familiar words. And then we took those words that have very low associative strength. And then we post hoc also measure for these words that we selected whether there is any preference to assigning them to category of fruits or category of animals. So yes, so we came bottom up basically for that selection. That's it.
Well, I was just gonna say something about the traditional approach for language models.
Yes.
Well, I not totally agree about the semantic emergence of language in such models, because even though they are very good at predicting language and making creative outputs like TP3 models in third one, and also however, they rely on enormous amount of data and like the entire Wikipedia, that's the amount of data that no ever has ever achieved. Because we not only have all the language that is made at this time, but all the language that was made before and that is continuing to be made. Like this kind of models that are fed on the Twitter or social media, they know a lot because, well, they have seen a lot, and that's also why they exploit some racist behaviors, sexist behaviors.
Well, I think that we do not disagree. I think that we do agree, and that machines are not human. They do not work the same, and that these algorithms, it's limited what we can infer about how we learn right from that. And that's why we ran that last study that I showed to you, where we ask the question, now that we know, or at least have some knowledge about what's available early on, what can be learned when we take into account limitations of human learner and limitations of human learner's input. So you remember there, we rely solely on the input. We search from the child, through the child's database, and calculated what can be learned when you just learn from that, which is very different than learning from the whole Wikipedia, right? But even when you learn from that, there is a lot, right, of regularities you can pick up. So it's true, those algorithms learn from immense amount of data. They're just given for free like that, right, thrown at them. And then they calculate this, right, very complex, multidimensional vectors. And nobody thinks that that's how humans learn, most probably not. But the point is what those models do demonstrate is that information does exist there, and even if you use fairly simple mechanisms, you can extract that information. So that's it. That's what I'm saying. You know, like that's an inspiration that we can get, but to build on that and work more to build actually human model. Well, thank you. Those are all the questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate your time and the knowledge you share with us. So thank you very much.
Thank you. This was wonderful because it's been a while that I didn't get a chance to talk with people in person. So this is fun.
We enjoyed it a lot. Muchas gracias a quienes nos acompañaron en YouTube y a los pocos que nos pudieron acompañar presencialmente. Thank you.